All right, welcome back, history students. When we look at the grand timeline of human history, it is so easy to just skip right over the Copper Age. We kind of tend to view it as this blurry, vaguely defined transition period, right? Just sandwiched somewhere between the cavemen of the Stone Age and the towering pharaohs of the Bronze Age. But today, we're going to reframe that entirely. The Copper Age wasn't just some historical waiting room. It was the fundamental catalyst that literally built civilization as we know it.
So, here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the Chalcolithic Bridge, look at exactly why copper beat out stone, and then explore the urban revolution. From there, we'll get into tokens, temples, and kings, uncover a pretty toxic accident involving early bronze, and finally see how all of this laid the solid foundations for those massive Bronze Age empires we always read about.
Okay, part one, the Chalcolithic Bridge.
Let's set the stage for how humanity actually crossed over from prehistory into ancient history. The literal definition of this era is honestly super fascinating. Chalcolithic comes from the Greek words for copper and stone, and that hits the nail on the head for what was actually happening on the ground. Because think about it, the adoption of metal wasn't some overnight switch where people just tossed their rocks out the window. It was a really gradual advancement that lasted over 1,000 years. Stone tools were still widely used right alongside those early copper ones. So yeah, the dividing line between these ages is pretty blurry, but it's an incredibly dynamic time.
Moving on to part two, why copper beats stone.
So why did early farmers, like the folks in the widespread Halaf culture, start smelting copper instead of just sticking with their trusty rocks? Well, there are some deeply practical reasons why copper was the absolute obvious first choice for these early metallurgists. First off, it oxidizes into these really attractive, bright shades of green. If you're out foraging or mining, it practically waves at you, right? It totally stands out from all the boring rocks. Second, it's got a relatively low melting point, which was completely manageable for early, primitive furnaces. And third, it's just one of the more plentiful metals out there. This is exactly why we see evidence of copper smelting being discovered independently all over the globe, from Israel to Serbia and eventually making its way to East Asia and the Americas. Now, you might be thinking, weren't stone tools actually sharper? And you'd be right. Stones like obsidian and flint were indeed sharper than copper, but man, were they brittle. Producing a polished stone axe was this intensely agonizing labor process. It required immense patience. If you're chopping wood and you hit a hard root, bam, the stone shatters, and hours, maybe even days of intense labor are literally erased in a second. But copper? Copper is malleable. If you hit that same root with a copper axe, the edge just bends. You sit down, hammer it back into shape, and boom, you're right back to work. And that brings us to the ultimate game changer for survival and trade, copper's endless life cycle. Just imagine a single chunk of copper. First, it gets mined and cast into some beautiful jewelry. But let's say a conflict breaks out. Well, that same jewelry is melted down into an arrowhead or a dagger for war. Once the war ends, it's melted right back down into a farming tool. And because it was still so rare and precious, it was often passed down from father to son as an inheritance. This unparalleled efficiency is the whole key here. Because these tools were so reliable and 100% recyclable, fewer people had to spend their days agonizing over easily breakable stone tools. That physically freed up the population to specialize in brand new trades and occupations. Which perfectly tees up part 3, irrigating the urban revolution. While all this metallurgy was advancing, there were these monumental changes simultaneously transforming the environment. Society essentially hit two massive tech tree unlocks. First up, the potter's wheel, which dramatically slashed the time needed to churn out storage vessels. But the real game changer was irrigation. Before this, southern Mesopotamia was practically empty. It had super low rainfall and was just covered in unusable, swampy marshlands around the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. But by mastering irrigation, cultures like the Ubaid literally engineered the landscape, finally cultivating all that previously unusable land. And the result of that epic landscape engineering? A staggering population boom. Try to wrap your head around this number. 80,000. That is the estimated population of the city of Uruk. To put that into perspective for us history students, earlier Neolithic settlements only held a few hundred people. Maybe a couple thousand at their absolute peak before they inevitably declined. But Uruk, utilizing these agricultural and technological unlocks, absolutely exploded, transforming into the most densely populated area on Earth at the time. That brings us to part 4, tokens, temples, and kings. So, you've got 80,000 people living together. That introduces a very immediate, very massive problem. How on earth do you organize them all? Let's trace how administration evolved to handle this. In the first era, tribal leaders could just rely on human memory to manage small stockpiles of food. Easy enough. But as populations skyrocketed around these new temple administrative centers, memory just failed. So, in Era 2, they invented basic clay tokens to keep track of goods. By Era 3, these had evolved into pictographic tokens that literally denoted ownership, a specific mark that meant this equals 10 goats. And finally, in Era 4, this absolute necessity birthed early writing on Urk period tablets. They were recording contracts, transactions, personal names. Keep in mind, writing wasn't invented to write beautiful poetry, it was literally invented for accounting.
Naturally, with these massive populations came serious centralization. The later Sumerians actually believed that Eridu was the very first city in the world, and crucially, the first city to have a king. It became this major religious hub where kings paid tribute. And this centralization fueled an absolutely ravenous demand for resources. To build bigger temples and equip these larger centralized armies, these kings needed more copper, and that aggressively incentivized longer-distance trade routes than humanity had ever seen before.
And that leads us to Part 5, the toxic bronze accident.
Now we're going to pivot to this fascinating, honestly kind of dark comedy narrative of how this ravenous trade led early empires to discover stronger metallic alloys. See, places like Mesopotamia and Egypt had massive ambitions, but they lacked local copper. They had to go out and find it. In Egypt, long before the age of the famous pharaohs, you had these fiercely warring kingdoms. But the moment they united, their absolute top priority was immediately securing the incredibly rich copper mines way out in the distant Sinai Desert. Controlling that supply chain was survival. But here is the wild twist of fate. A lot of the copper ore they were mining out there in the Sinai Desert contained trace amounts of a naturally occurring element, arsenic. So when they smelted it, they unintentionally created arsenical bronze, which is copper that contains more than 1% arsenic. And to their absolute delight, this accidental alloy turned out to be significantly harder and stronger than pure copper. Almost overnight, it became the ancient gold standard for superior weapons and tools. There was, however, a massive catch. While arsenical bronze gave them that superior strength, it came with the highly inferior side effect of being insanely toxic. Ancient blacksmiths were slowly poisoning themselves with toxic fumes just to forge better weapons. I mean, talk about a workplace hazard, right? This lethal reality motivated generations of desperate experimentation. Eventually, thankfully, they figured out that if they traded for a much rarer metal called tin, they could create true bronze. It was stronger, it held a way better edge, and crucially, it didn't kill the blacksmith making it. This transition from accidental poison to engineered alloy is exactly what ushered in the next great age of human history. Which brings us to our final section, Part 6, Foundations of Bronze Empires. Let's bring this narrative arc to its culmination. What is the ultimate legacy of the Copper Age? Really, it boils down to intense, pragmatic problem solving. By adopting copper, perfecting the potter's wheel, and mastering irrigation, humanity drastically increased its productivity. We went from isolated hamlets to sprawling cities managed by powerful kings and priests. They established complex writing systems that finally allowed for chronological historical records. The Copper Age quite literally assembled every single necessary building block for the great Bronze Age empires of Sumer, Akkad, Egypt, and Babylon to rise. To the later Sumerians, the Copper Age had already faded into this time of myth and legend. A magical era where kings supposedly walked with gods. But looking at all the evidence we've covered in today's explainer, I want to leave you with this question to chew on. Is the Copper Age truly just a time of myth, or is it actually the deeply practical, foundational blueprint of modern human society? When you trace the line from a simple bent copper axe to the sprawling logistics of written empires, it is really hard not to see it as the latter. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking those big questions, and I will see